I vividly remember the day I fully embraced my nigger self. That's right.
Tell me about it.
Let me tell you about it. I was invited to talk about unconscious racism to the prison guards and administrators at Terminal Island, San Pedro, California. As part of my visit, I toured the cell blocks and prison grounds. Without exaggeration, nearly all I saw was black and brown faces. Of course, as a law professor, I knew the statistics about the staggeringly disproportionate rate of minority incarceration, but nothing viscerally registers the reality of those abstract numbers like looking through the cages into the eyes of young men behind the statistics. I saw in their faces the eyes of the kids I'd grown up with, most of whom did or are doing time: Junebug, Popeye, P. Comet, Roach, Day-Day, Money. Each new face was a looking glass. For without serious government intervention in my own life, upward bound, a better chance, there surely go I. I also saw in those cold, raw cages the face of my father, who was a prison inmate for most of my youth. Just before my tour of Terminal Island, I ran across the Randy Kennedy and Chris Rock efforts to distinguish between good Negroes and bad Negroes, or niggers, reserving the term niggers for blacks who commit crimes. By this logic, because 56% of black males in Baltimore and 33% of those in the state of California are in prison, on probation, or on parole, those staggeringly high percentages of young brothers in those jurisdictions are, by hypothesis, niggers. There's class bigotry in the politics of respectability also. Because the crime rate between middle-class blacks and middle-class whites is indistinguishable, most of the black folk committing street crimes are poor. Thus, the good Negroes are disproportionately above the poverty line, while the niggers are disproportionately below. Unless you think people are poor because they are bad, then you must recognize that perhaps they are bad because they're poor. Their wrongdoing, in other words, may not be something, right? Their wrongdoing, in other words, may not be something that can be entirely attributed to their bad choices or bad character. Rather, abject poverty, unemployment, crumbling schools, and other external pressures they cannot control share responsibility. So that's how they look at my dad and the brothers I grew up with, I thought. Bad Negroes and niggers. Then it struck me. Because they say the apple never falls far from the tree, and birds of a feather flock together, and above all, because there but for the grace of God go I guess that makes me a nigger too. Put differently, when I say call me a nigger, I'm saying in the strongest possible language that I reject Kennedy's and Rock's and Bill Cosby's and Juan Williams and Clarence Thomas's invitation to play a politics of respectability and distinction by regarding impoverished brothers and sisters not that I don't feel sympathy for victims of crime, but as Glenn Loury has observed, the young black men wreaking havoc in the ghetto are still our youngsters in the eyes of many of the decent, poor, and working class black people who are often their victims. For many of these people, the hard edge of judgment and retribution is tempered by sympathy for and empathy with the perpetrators. In brief, I find a politics of distinction both odious and futile. Odious because it invites and encourages the rest of us to disown and condemn astonishingly high percentages of our own community. Futile because the practice of racial profiling, part of what I've referred to as the black tax, a tie that binds us all together, means that for police and other social actors, respectable Negroes and niggers are cats of the very same hue. Thus, call me a nigger both proclaims my solidarity and internally willed identification with the poverty-stricken pariahs in the black community, and acknowledges the externally imposed risk we all share, irrespective of our zip code, pedigree, or tax bracket. Should we pour liquor for Tukey? A year and a half ago, California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger refused to grant clemency to one of the state's most notorious ex-gang members, Stanley Tukey Williams. Williams, a founding member of the Crips gang, was convicted of gunning down 4 people while robbing a convenience store and a motel in 1979. A host of rappers, including Snoop Dogg, POW, Paris, Cam, Shorty, WC, Tank, and others, rallied to save the condemned man. But the governor concluded that Williams had not achieved personal redemption and hence should be executed. Thus, Tukey's case starkly poses the dichotomy between redemption and retribution, and raises the question of the nature of personal redemption. It also raises the question of how white minds judge black hearts. For a claim of personal redemption essentially boils down to a claim that an individual's heart has undergone a radical transformation. Judges, jurors, and other legal decision makers are routinely called on to evaluate the hearts and minds of criminal defendants. And my own research in social psychology reveals a systematic tendency among whites to judge the hearts of black wrongdoers more harshly than similarly situated white ones. The key question here is, should we ever practice a politics of solidarity with cold-blooded killers? Should we ever regard them as one of us, or instead as irretrievably one of them? My good friend and colleague Ron Garrett will take up this question. As a constitutional law scholar, Ron teaches the Dred Scott case, in which the United States Supreme Court practiced the politics of distinction on a grand legal scale, declaring that all blacks, slaves as well as free, were not and could never become citizens of the United States. This is the 150th anniversary of that indelible stain on the American constitutional jurisprudence. While we're talking about redemption, we can ask ourselves whether a nation and its legal system can ever find redemption for such a heartless opinion and the inhumane institution that it defended. I believe in my heart that had I been Dred Scott and had been fleeing captivity with bloodhounds and slave owners and bounty hunters in hot pursuit, Ron would have been one of those whites on the Underground Railroad who committed the criminal act of harboring someone like me. According to the logic of Rock and Kennedy and others who stigmatize lawbreakers as them, such a criminal act by Ron would make him, a bad white man? That the law-abiding rest of us should distinguish ourselves from? Please welcome Professor Ron Garrett.
Who is the defendant tonight? Who is the prosecutor? Who pleads the cause? The well is running dry, says the poet Lupe Fiasco. The days of Malcolm and Martin have ended. Our hope has descended, and us to the side. But God has another solution that has evolved from the hood. Our hope has descended. A first interpretation. Our hope is diminished. It is baseless. It is running out. A second interpretation. Our hope itself has descended into the human condition, has descended even into this auditorium, and is with us this night. God's solution is growing from the hood. The neighborhood. But who is the neighbor? I seem to remember a story about a lawyer who asked that question. The lawyer turned to a singer of tales, and he asked for clarification. Or maybe he was just showing off, as lawyers do. Who is the neighbor? And the singer of tales answered, there was a man who was returning home to his gated residential community in Los Angeles when he was attacked by thieves who mugged him and took his clothes and his wallet and left him half dead. By chance, who should come walking along but the security guard who had just ended his shift? But when the security guard saw the man, he crossed to the other side of the street and passed on by. Then the man saw the president of the condominium association coming along, and his heart lifted up. Surely this man will help me. But when the president of the condominium association caught sight of him, he hurried away and did nothing. But then two women came walking toward him down the road, and he trembled inside because he was sure that they were from the hood, and they were wearing clothes, and he was sure that those clothes meant that they belonged to a street gang. And as they neared him, he could see that they were gesturing, and he was sure that they were making gang signs to one another. But one of the women knelt beside him and had compassion on him and bound up his wounds. She knew hurt. Her dad was a junkie, and she had been molested, and her name was Brenda, and she bound up the man's wounds. And the other woman helped Brenda set the man on his feet, and the other woman was a Latina. And the other woman helped Brenda carry the man, and the other woman was an undocumented alien. And the other woman helped carry the man to the nearest shelter, a shelter for battered women. And the other woman, who was a lesbian, made a contribution to the shelter saying, take care of this man, and I will repay you. I think that's how the story goes. And it ends with the singer of tales asking the lawyer, who was neighbor to the man who was mugged? And the lawyer understood that the neighbor is the one whose aid we do not expect. The neighbor is the one who heals because she knows hurt. The neighbor is our Redeemer, and though we do not see her face, hers is the face of the poor and the molested and the addicted, and she has been called bitch and whore. The neighbor is our Redeemer, and though we do not see his face, his is the face of the enslaved and the lynched. Who is on trial tonight?
Yeah, I'm on 2.
Who prosecutes? Who pleads the cause? As Professor Armour says, we meet tonight 150 years after the infamous decision of the Supreme Court in the case of Dred Scott. Dred and Harriet Scott sued for the freedom of themselves and their children. We meet tonight on the 150th anniversary of the shameful decision by that court, which said that black Americans descended from the enslaved have no rights that the white man is bound to respect. That the famous words, all men are created equal, do not apply to them. A heinous crime was committed against Dred and Harriet Scott and their children. Has that crime been atoned for? Has every drop of blood drawn by the lash truly been paid for by the sword? Ice Cube warns us, as my student Doreen Anthony has also taught me, that slavery is not a dead fact buried in the ground of history, but a living reality. Cube warns of what happens when neighbors turn snitches, when your words somehow incarcerate me, and my words somehow incarcerate you. When they get you in them lonely, dark places, concrete slave ships. Dred Scott certainly would agree and would say to the judges, these texts these words you speak, these interpretations you offer, they incarcerate me. So I will speak my words, and I will sing my own song, or be enslaved to another man's. You have taught me the enslaving meaning of all men are created equal. Now, let me teach you the liberating meaning of redeemed equal. Redeemed equal. And so Dread is with us tonight, and Dread is our neighbor. Our hope has descended. Dread is our hope. 3 condemned men are brought before the executioner, and they're arranged side by side on the killing ground, maybe strapped to a gurney with an IV drip, maybe hanging from a gallows or a tree, side by side, the 3 of them. On one side, the murderer and gangbanger. On the other side, an upright judge, respected Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, pronouncer of legal fate. Who is redeemed? Who redeems? From what are we redeemed? To what? And for what are we redeemed? 3 condemned men, and I am hanging with them tonight, hanging with them, looking to the one in the middle. Kanye West worried that if he talked about God in his music, his record wouldn't get played. But he went on anyway. Well, let this take away from my spins, which will probably take away from my ends. Then I hope it will take away from my sins. I know that my Redeemer liveth. To us hustlers, killers, murderers, drug dealers, our Redeemer walks with us. To us victims of welfare, for we living in hell here, hell yeah, our Redeemer walks with us. To us who are condemned to die for what we have done, our Redeemer walks with us. To us lawyers and judges and teachers and students, our Redeemer walks with us. So I pray, you who created us equal and has redeemed us before, we ask you to redeem us once again. We are the defendant and the prosecutor, the judge and the jury. We accuse and we stand accused. Bring light to us tonight, light to the lonely, dark places. Amen.